Yes, I prefer he or they.
He or they. And Fergus? Opening off, who's speaking first? I'm not sure if
Helena is speaking and I don't mind. She
don't mind.
It's fine.
And Stefan is speaking second.
I don't mind for he.
Closing Garth is speaking first.
John speaking first, he.
And Ian is speaking first.
He or they.
And David Page is speaking first.
Richard speaking first, he or they.
And Stephen is speaking first.
And Stephen, he or they as well, please. Thank you.
Okay. Well, in that case, we'll get started without any further ado. As you may have noticed, this is a live stream. I'm requested to ask that you speak from that table there. If you're planning on speaking anywhere else, please don't, just because there's a microphone set up so they can actually hear you. And unless there are any questions, I'd now like to invite the Prime Minister, Matt, to open the case for his side.
Images of crying children in war-ridden countries, images of desolation and sorrow in the aftermath of a hurricane or of fly-ridden wounds are not just photos. They're not just pictures from time. They speak to some of the most meaningful moments in an individual or a community's life. And we on Proposition say it is fundamentally illegitimate for organisations to prostitute those images for their own ideological ends. We say even if they are intending to have good consequences, we say they are illegitimate in doing so. Moreover, we are going to contend that this sort of campaigning leads to bad charitable giving, and charitable giving that would be better were these images not to be around. 3 things in opening the case for the government today. I'm going to talk to you about consent and why it lacks in these situations. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about the dehumanising effects of these sort of campaigning. And thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about the denial of agency that is entailed. First of all, by way of a definition, we foresee this policy being implemented by regulators of broadcasting or print media, which currently exist in the media, and would apply the same sort of punishments as we would have for those who transgress existing rules, for example, on swearing before the watershed or graphic images of violence. We've envisaged mainly fines or potential bans from TV. The sort of images that we are talking about are those which depict graphic violence, gore, or severe depictions of human distress and suffering. So, for example, we would not be okay with showing images of a crying family in the aftermath of a hurricane. We would be okay with images of the impact that hurricane had had in terms of buildings that had been destroyed potentially. So moving on to my first point about consent. We say that individuals have emotions, obviously, and our emotional actions are something which are very important to us. We say individuals should have, first of all, should have ownership over those emotions and those emotional outcomes, and secondly, they should not be used illegitimately by the end of, I'll take you in one moment, by the end of another organisation to use those emotions to pursue their own ends without that individual's prior consent. Go ahead.
Would you allow these photos to be published if they were able to obtain such written consent from the individuals they were using?
So firstly, we think this debate is happening in the real world, and in the real world, that sort of consent is vaguely impossible to achieve. As I'm going to prove in points 2 and 3, we think our case would still stand even if that consent would be attained. But given that we want to have this debate as these sort of images are used at the moment, we do think that the lack of consent and the lack thereof is a very serious problem that we want to engage with. The reason that consent is so important is firstly those photos may be taken to be used to ends which the individual in question may not agree with, may not be in a position to understand. It's very difficult for someone in the aftermath of a hurricane to be able to understand the full implications of what having their photo may be taken may mean, even if there is, a semblance of consent to that. Secondly, we say the assumption of good on the part of the charities who are using this, and the fact that we assume that they're doing good things, removes the ability of the individual to have the capacity to organise their own life and their emotional outcomes. We would draw an analogy with the example of even if an individual, we point to the example of, for example, sex tapes. Okay, we think that the fact that even though you've consented to having sex, and you may well have having consent to having it either filmed, even in those instances, we say it's illegitimate for organisations to take that moment from your life, capture it, which speaks to a very deep part of your personality, and use it for their own ends. We think this would still apply, even if the footage that was being used for educational purposes. We say the initial lack of consent or the ability to consent meaningfully about something which is incredibly meaningful to individuals, no thank you, means that it is illegitimate for these organisations to use this material in such a way. So, moving on to my second point about dehumanisation, no thank you. Because what we say these sorts of images do is frequently depict people in incredible states of vulnerability and in states of severe helplessness. We say, even though you may be in those sorts of situations, your ability to have decision-making and to have control and agency over your own life is not removed. We say that is the first problem of these sorts of images. We say the second thing, though, is it is wrong to use those moments of severe distress and helplessness to further the ends of an organisation. We say often these organisations are profoundly ideologically driven. We point to the examples of missionaries. We point to the examples of Bible distributors, also volunteer tourism. These sorts of charities and these sorts of causes are not just trying to do a good thing. They are trying to provide a certain set of outcomes adhering to a certain set of moral norms and maybe in interaction with different sets of laws. We say it's impossible for the individuals who are depicted by these images to fully have the ability to consent to all of these things. Even if it is not the case, even if it is the case that there can be a broad semblance of understanding, we still say it is dehumanising to them to use them for the ends of organisations which may not be fully understood. Go ahead.
By and large, showing pictures of communities which were destroyed also influences these people greatly. So where is the distinction between showing how my house was destroyed and showing me crying?
So we think the difference there is that a house doesn't have these sorts of emotions or interactions. We say there is a sliding scale here that we are talking about. We do draw a very firm line over depictions of individuals and their individual moments of suffering. We also think, though, that the sort of images that you do show shouldn't be sensationalised, right? We don't think that the sort of depictions of destruction that you show should be couched with dramatic music and sensationalist language. We instead think that this better sort of giving would be where these problems to be explained in simple, clear language to allow people to appeal to the critical faculties of audiences rather than their sort of base visceral emotional faculties. We think that would lead to better sort of charitable giving, something which Fergus is going to talk about in more detail in his speech. Thirdly, we also, third point of substantive, the denial of agency that this entails. These sorts of images suggest that the people contained within them are fundamentally helpless. They are unable to ever help themselves. Moreover, it claims the same about entire societies. We say this is particularly problematic, given that lots of the sorts of aid organisations we are talking about are former colonial societies. We say this encourages a sense of that these societies are perennially helpless and must always find ways to have help from the outside. We say it discourages the sorts of solutions which actually allow these societies to build up and to govern themselves. We'll point to the example of the aftermath of the Haitian earthquake in 2010, when images proliferated of families scavenging in rubble, which were portrayed as showing them as being fundamentally inept and ill-organised. We say what that led to was a sort of Christian missionary adoption agencies going into Haiti, taking these children, and actually because of that sort of images of complete helplessness, not viewing these individuals or that society as one which had the agency to be able to help itself. We think on a principled level this is fundamentally wrong. We also think that it leads to ramshackle solutions that do not actually speak to the real nature of the problems afflicting these societies and lead to sort of bad charitable giving. Why is this the case? Because the sort of aid that is encouraged is inevitably that which results from the sort of appeal to viscerality. We say you're far more likely to donate to the sort of charity which has the most distressing images rather than the one necessarily where your money and you could make the best impact. We point to the example again of the Haitian earthquake in 2010, a very sort of disastrous immediate charity which immediately presented these sorts of images. By contrast, at the same time, an equally severe disaster was unfurling in Pakistan with the severe flooding. That was a disaster which didn't immediately sort of gravitate towards the same emotional images. As a result, massively disproportionate donations to the Haitian campaign and donations of the sort which don't actually speak to the real problems. Ladies and gentlemen, this sort of campaigning leads to bad outcomes for all of the people concerned, but moreover we think is a principled violation of their consent and right to human dignity and human agency, and for that reason I'm exceptionally proud to propose.
May I start? Thank you, Madam Chair. We as the opening opposition do admit that sometimes people do not give consent on those photos, but what we want to say is that harms that can be created if people do not decide to donate money and if these charities lose the amount of money they need, the harms will be much bigger, Madam Chair. What we will explain to you is A, why we already have an issue to gather people to give money and why if we ban this we will have an even bigger issue. Secondly, we will explain to you how medias function today, and thirdly we will explain to you how putting people into discourse and understanding of the issue is actually very important. Before that, a couple of points of rebuttal. In terms of consent, yeah, we do admit that some of the people did not give the consent, but we think that these people are victims of much bigger issue than not giving consent of their photos being published. We think they're victims of starving, dying out of lack of water, and all of those kind of things. We think that those issues are extremely important, and we think that if we don't get people to give money for these kind of stuff, we will have more victims of much bigger issue than the consent. They also talk about agency. We want to tell you that these people already in status quo do not have their own agency because they cannot make the decisions. They simply have to do everything they can in order to survive. We think that by gathering people to actually give them money, we are going to give to them a better life, which means higher agency, because they will finally be able to think about something else rather than just surviving. We also want to say that sex tape analogy is not the same, because we think that the harms or benefits that you can get from publishing sex tape cannot be even compared to benefits that you can have if you have an emotional photo that will actually motivate people to donate money. Therefore, we think that sex tape analogy is not that. And we also want to say that in terms of pictures of places and not pictures of people. Firstly, people might identify with those places as much as they identify with themselves crying. But secondly, even more importantly, is that these pictures are much less influential on people in terms of motivating them to donate money, because people can see the place and see the harms that happen, but they cannot identify with that place. Rather than that, they can identify much more easily when they see a human being suffering and seeing the truth in their eyes, which is usually seen through those photos. And also what we want to say about the colonialism argument, that is factually not true, because many charities and many people not just send the money to the state, but they also go to that place and try to help them, give them the know-how, try to help them in terms of them self-developing. Therefore, we do not think that this narrative of those countries being incapable will continue on. No, thank you. Now let's go on to our constructive. So why do we think that we generally have issue in the status quo, but we think that this issue will be even much bigger? Firstly, people usually think about their own needs rather than someone else's, and they usually always have something they need and something they would rather buy from themselves than donate to anyone else. Unless they really see how much someone else needs something more than they do, we think that they will not have a huge incentive to actually donate the money. Leads me to my second thing, is that it's very hard for you to connect with someone who is so far away for various reasons. Number one, most of the people never went to Africa and saw through how big pain these people are actually going. Number two, there are huge cultural differences. You have many people in Europe and America still referring to Africa as a state, which means that they don't really get how those people live and what kind of issues are they actually facing with. Number three, we also think that the discourse of vast majority of states are their own issues. Politicians and media usually talk about the issues of that particular state rather than the issues that other people are facing with. Therefore, if we don't have this in the discourse, people will still not care and people will not have a motivation to actually give money. Number three, we also think that it's much easier for a person to identify with people from their own state rather than with someone who comes from a completely different state. So unless we actually show to them that people from other states are suffering much more than people from their state, we think that we will have a huge issue to motivate someone to identify with someone coming from Africa rather than someone coming from, I don't know, Hungary, if that particular person who should donate money comes from Hungary. And the fourth thing is, because of all of these reasons, governments are aware of the fact that they will much easily win votes if they invest money in their own country rather than some else. And that is something they want, of course, the power. So we think that if we want governments to be incentivized to give charities to other states, we need to have the support of the people. That leads me to my second point, which is media. We think that today's narrative in the media is the things that are sensational, that are popular, come in the discourse. That is simply the way that this world functions. So you have huge competition of sensational words. Everything that is sensational comes out. If you don't have that extremely well headline with a lot of pictures that a lot of people will be able to see, you're not getting the center of attention. Once you do not have the center of attention, you have many people having lack of information what is actually happening somewhere out there. Why should they care about it? Why should they actually donate the money? Once you have, once you have that particular situation, Madam Chair, no one is going to donate the money. Not just because they don't care, but also because they don't know that they should care. They don't know what's happening out there, because instead of having these kind of things being the front cover of other newspapers, you will have, I don't know, some starlet going out with some other very popular guy being more important, because that's the way the 24 hours news media function, that's the way of the status quo media. Yes?
We dispute that this will lead to a drop in charitable donations, but even if it does, what gives you the right to say that is more important than the right of these individuals to consent?
I think that any individual in this world would rather choose someone to give him money for bread, therefore they can survive, rather than choosing to give a consent to some photo that might lead to them saving their own life. I mean, sorry, Madam Chair, but these people are drinking blood sometimes for the amount of thirstiness they feel in that particular moment. We're sure that they would consent for some pictures being published if that would be something that can give them lives. And that leads me to my third point. Why putting people in the discourse through media and through sensational stuff will lead to money being get. So once you have the media, you have people knowing this. Some of the people will become interested. Why? Because once you don't have the sensational stuff, people from Africa that are starving are just numbers to you. Once you have the emotional thing, you get to identify with them. You get to realize how serious their situation is. You get to realize all the 4 points that I made about why people won't care. You realize why you should care and why your issues aren't the priority ones. What does that mean? That means that people will start donating their money. That means that also celebrities that do have an incentive of being on front cover will realize that this is something that can bring them more popularity. And then you will have Angelina Jolie going throughout the world donating money because she knows that people know about this issue. She knows that this issue is important. She knows that this issue is going to get you front cover. Also, when people start caring, you will have a situation where other countries and governments will be pressed by the people to do that. We have an example of that. Floods happened in Balkans very recently, exactly because it was sensational, because people saw it on front covers. You had European Union supporting it. You had many countries supporting it. You even have the Yugoslav identity uniting again together because they realized that people do need actual help. But all the front covers were sensational. All the front covers showed the full pain of people. Let's give you a comparative. Once we didn't have things in news in Central African Republic, in the situation that happened there, no one cared, Madam Chair, what happened there, how can they contribute to the situation being much better? Because people, even though they're not government, therefore they don't have the power, they have the power to push other people and other governments to act in a way that is good. So what do we give you? Yes, we sacrifice the consent of some people, but we give lives and money to more people, and we find that more important. For all these reasons, extremely proud to oppose the motion. Thank you, Madam Chair.
To continue the government side of this debate, I'd now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister for us.
The idea that people in Africa are always starving, that people in Africa are desperate and cannot do anything without the help of the West, the idea that people in Africa drink each other's blood because they haven't got the help of the white man to get them back into a situation where they don't need to do that, is abhorrent on its own terms. That's what Matt told you in his speech. What I'm going to do in my substantive material is explain why those images are not only immoral on the face of it, irrespective of the benefits which they might bring about, but are actively harmful to people in those states, to the development of those nations, and the people who they most care about helping. So broadly, there will be two parts to this speech. No, that's not a helpful way of structuring it. Two things in rebuttal. Firstly, I'll reconstruct and defend some of the principled stuff that Matt brings you in his speech. Second area of rebuttal will be about whether we need these kinds of ads to get people to care. Then in substantive, I'll be explaining why these ads bias aid to short-termism in an incredibly harmful way and changes how people and companies interact with post-colonial states and why that's so harmful. No thanks. So firstly, in rebuttal about the principled issues. All the response that we really get here is that, like, maybe sometimes they'll consent or maybe they would have, and also we think that the harms are worse. That is the wrong paradigm. That is not the paradigm that Matt was talking about throughout his speech. The point was not that it is a harm to someone to dehumanize them or to use their images without their consent. The point is that that is something that it is immoral to do. For reasons that he explained extensively, it is immoral to use someone's image in ways that they haven't consented to, possibly for ends, no thanks, that they don't support. It's not just about people consenting to bread. You may be using those images of those people to do things that they think are forbidden. You may be using images of Muslim people for a Christian charity which they do not agree with the ends of. You may be using images of people who have died when that culture forbids the use of those kinds of images. It is just not okay to say, well, yeah, they're really hungry, so it's probably fine to treat them however we want. And that's the paradigm that Matt brought to you. They didn't engage with that at all. It is not for the opening opposition team to decide whether it is acceptable to use people's images in ways that they haven't consented to and which are incredibly degrading to their agency and the responsibility of human beings, which reinforce colonial perspectives on those people. That is incredibly damaging. That is incredibly immoral. They didn't engage with that perspective on those actions. Second area of rebuttal. Do we need these ads to get people to care? What they tell us is, well, people won't donate if we don't have these kinds of ads. We think people are perfectly able to be moved to action on the basis of their critical faculties, their recognition that there is an earthquake, no thanks, taking place in Pakistan, in Haiti, that there are floods in Pakistan, and that those are issues that they need to react to. People do care, right? That's why these images are effective, but you don't need to exploit that care with these images. You can access it by presenting the reality of that situation through, by engaging with those critical perspectives. They then tell you that, well, you can't compete with other kinds of advertising. It is just mind-boggling thinking to suggest that these kinds of ads are competing for space with celebrity magazines and pictures of Angelina Jolie and whoever she might be married to or not married to at the moment. Bugger if I know. No thanks. The point is that that is not the comparison that we're talking about. The comparison that's more being talked about is in competition with other charities, specifically other international aid charities, which they do talk about a bit, and I'm going to talk about that more later. But in that case, note, Madam Speaker, that what you're doing is explicitly using these images without people's consent in ways that degrade them in order to help solve your organisational problems, in order to help you raise more money than the organisations that are competing with you. That is abhorrent. We shouldn't be used for logistical ends like that, and that explained that. Okay, second half of this speech is about how this is actively harmful, whether or not it's immoral, that we think that is primarily the ground that we want to stake our case on in this debate. So, yeah, go ahead.
When someone is gone missing, you publish that someone's photo in order to find that someone, even though that someone never gave the consent. Would you also agree that this applies
Okay,
for
you don't publish a photo of them in their most vulnerable moments. You don't publish a photo of them in circumstances you publish a mugshot, Madam Chair. That is an entirely different thing to presenting images of visceral suffering which are designed to exploit people's emotional capacities and reinforce abhorrent perspectives. That just doesn't stand up. Okay, how does this bias aid to short-termism? There are two layers here. Firstly, the problem is that money raised by these kinds of campaigns can't go to long or even medium-term projects. There is already significant pressure on charities to behave as they advertise they are behaving. There is anger on charities when they spend money on staff rather than on buying food or mosquito nets. There is anger at charities when they redirect money to projects other than the ones that the advertising was suggesting that money was for. That means that you can't get support when all the advertising is based on this kind of visceral imagery about short-term crises like famines, like earthquakes. You can't get support for projects that are about long-term reforms to governance in those areas. You can't get support for projects that would actually give long-term benefits to the people on the ground in those areas. For example, Haiti has been a nightmare for decades, and the fact that there was an earthquake in 2010, which suddenly attracted aid to that area, just shines a light on the fact that in the presence of that kind of visceral advertising, you can't get support for projects that are longer term and that would help those people and that country in the longer term get out of that cycle of poverty and solve those problems at their root. That's incredibly problem. The transience of the aid that you get as a result of these campaigns is awful. The second thing, though, is that exactly by the mechanisms that they suggest, you create a sort of bidding war between charities to use the most visceral images. That's really bad for a couple of reasons. Because when you're competing for donations and you want to use the most visceral images possible, firstly, you just get lots more bad ads that are immoral for all the reasons that we've told you about extensively. But secondly, you incentivize charities to shop around for the worst areas they can find, to go to where there are natural disasters rather than to stay where there are long-term issues, in order to get money, in order to function and achieve your goals. That means that those NGOs don't have incentives to stay in areas where there are long-term projects, because staying there, they won't be able to get the money that they want to deliver on their aims. Secondly, how does this change how people interact with post-colonial countries? What we want to say is that these images portray these countries as basket cases which are desperate, and some of the imagery that you get in the opposition leader's speech is suggestive of the primitivism that's portrayed by those images. That's problematic for three reasons. Volunteer tourism, something that they're happy with, is a terrible, terrible thing. It means that people who aren't qualified go to take simple jobs that might otherwise be fulfilled by people in that community who would get long-term benefits from being employed. That's really bad. Secondly, you get less normal tourism. You're not going to go somewhere on holiday if your perspective of that place is that people there are starving, that there's no clean water in that place. That's bad, because tourism is key for these kinds of countries. It's a good industry to start up with that creates better jobs. Thirdly, companies are less likely to invest in these countries, not because they have no analysts, but because they're not going to direct their analysts to look at countries that they think are full of starving people that have no infrastructure. That's bad, because you don't get companies providing jobs, providing money, and pressuring governments to improve. Madam Chair, you make the lives of these people significantly worse off. More importantly, you treat them in a fundamentally immoral way. We're extremely proud of this.
Is there a reason it's staying dark?
Oh,
Otherwise?
Judge, is there a light switch we can?
Yeah,
Yeah, there is. It's not because of the camera, right? Madam Chair, I want to talk to you about consent. And we will take the criteria of opening up and beat them on their own criteria. And we want to talk about donations and how we don't think that donations are a zero-sum game where the people will now be able to donate to long-term causes just because there is no such things. But before that, let's deal with their case, step by step. First, about the charities they talk about. They say that the problem with these charities is that, one, a lot of them are missionary charities, so you as a Muslim might not necessarily agree without being used as an image for them. And two, that often they only further the narrative of colonialism. So firstly, with regards to missionary charities, they don't function in this sort of way. The vast majority of them appeal to a different group. They mostly appeal to religious groups within your own country. Those people donate for different causes. They mainly donate for aid, but also for the spreading of religion. To a vast majority of these individuals to whom missionaries appeal to do not make their decisions based on that. Two, they tell us that this only furthers a narrative of colonialism. Now, we have several replies here, but the main one is that just because at one moment in time these countries were colonized does not mean that when they suffer a natural catastrophe, they shouldn't be helped. Moreover, precisely because colonialism caused huge harms to these countries and huge injustices is precisely the reason as to why people from those countries should donate to them, and moreover why they should be motivated precisely by these kinds of images to donate to them. Helena gave you a lot of reasons as to why this will make them more likely to donate, mostly unresponded to. So then they tell us, well, by doing this, we lose on long-term benefits. Now recognize firstly that this clashes with the point the previous speaker made just before that. So he said that people mostly base those decisions on rational things. So rationally assessing which country needs aid. But so if they want to claim that they actually care about long-term benefits, then people can already weigh that out, so they can't claim both. But more importantly, these things are not a zero-sum game. That means that people don't always have an X amount of money they want to donate to charity, so if they don't donate it to short-term causes, they will donate it to long-term causes. That is simply false. There are always long-term causes people can donate to, but if you look at how charities work, the amount of donations increases every time you have a natural catastrophe, which means that there are always people who donate to long-term causes, but the ones who donate to short-term causes like natural catastrophes simply fluctuate. So we don't think that point stands. Lastly, they tell us, well, this harms these countries a lot because of three things. One, the missionaries could go there, often fill low-level jobs. Two, tourism, it harms tourism. Three, it harms companies. Now, with regards to the last two, people usually research the country they want to go to before they go there. So if Haiti had an earthquake, whether or not you had visceral pictures in the media, you probably won't go there in the first place. Companies always so even if companies won't even consider these countries for investments, that's not necessarily comparative, because on our side of the house, on their side of the house, okay, they will consider them for investing. Look, this country had a natural disaster, there is no infrastructure, and simply decide not to. With regards to low-end jobs, not all charities do this, but often they help create jobs for the long run. They also bring money into the local economy, which they spend there. No, let's talk about consent. Now, one, they tell us this harms people's agency. Helena already tells you they already effectively lost their agency at the moment when their whole livelihood is completely destroyed. Secondly, we also tell you that I can have a strong bond with my community. I can have a strong reaction to my town being shown as completely destroyed and in complete shambles. They can also that also may harm me precisely based on their criteria. Three, and most importantly, we think that the lives of people who are often harmed supersede the ability of individuals to choose their own privacy, i.e. having their images not published. We already put this in an example. A person can go missing. You can still publish a picture of them, even though they did not explicitly give consent. Now, what their answer to that is, well, yes, but the difference is that these pictures are visceral. These pictures are abhorrent. One, if you saw my ID picture, it's equally abhorrent, trust me. But on a more serious note, who are they to decide for that? Every individual can decide that for themselves. So even if they put a mugshot, I can still feel that infringes upon my agency. Only these individuals can decide what is abhorrent and what is not. According to that very same metric, you can effectively never publish a picture without people consenting, which with the same criteria goes for mugshots. Noting, 4, if that is your main issue, then you can simply make them give consent to those pictures. We don't think that is that unrealistic. And 5thly, often those pictures are not necessarily taken for charity uses in the first place. So they continue to exist whether you gave consent or not. They are often taken by professional photographers, and they will exist whether charities publish them or not. Go.
Okay, it's your own teammates' analysis that says that you can't get donations to non-sensational causes when they're competing with sensational ads. So you can't just say that people will donate to long-term projects anyway. That contradicts the case that you brought.
No. The case we gave you is that 24 hours news media generally already became sensational. News articles are far shorter. People's attention spans are far lower. So even if all charities are banned from doing this, they will simply lose to a lot of other things which will occupy those people's attention. And this information which you want to give to them will simply never reach them. So, about donations, what do they tell us? They tell us that people often make those decisions based on rational thinking, and this analysis is largely assertive without any proof of it. 1, I already point out in a POI, why is that, in my rebuttal, why is that contradictory with the previous point? But 2, it is empirically untrue. In the last 15 years, aid has been reducing. 3, the main problem is something which Helena brings to you, which is that often it's far harder for people to identify with individuals who come from different communities which are not the same as the one they are from, which is why often people from Western countries have a problem with donating money to developing ones, because often the cultures are different and some of them are even racist. Often they cannot find a link with these people. And lastly, they tell us, yes, but now those charities will continue to shop for worse and worse images, to which we say good. If they find the worst images possible, we tell you that this is something which is more likely to motivate people to donate to those causes, to think about the suffering of those individuals. Finally, in order for people to identify with a charitable cause, they do need to see suffering, because it's something they understand and something they wish would not happen to them. Because it's so far away from them, it needs to be magnified in order for that to reach their attention. If it doesn't happen, they simply never gain that information and they never donate to such a cause. Madam Chair, consent is important, but saving more lives and helping these people have more agency is far better. Very proud to oppose.
Madam Speaker, in extension, we're going to do 2 things. First of all, we're going to extend on opening's explanation of the moral obligation to ban this that more appropriately deals with operating this. And second of all, we're going to tackle HOO when they tell us that this is going to be a very effective method of fundraising. I'm going to talk to you as a former fundraiser myself and tell you how, well, by banning this, we're going to get better donors, more donors, and better discourse of the type they talk about under this model. So first of all, we absolutely accept opening's moral explanation about why this is incredibly dehumanizing on an individual level. We'd like to build on that. So from a state perspective, we say, look, we like to ban something when, 1, there is an active harm incurred to an individual for the consumption of a good or service or witnessing an ad. In this case, the harms are incredibly large. So firstly, we get the direct emotional distress to the individual when witnessing these images, because they're depicting, like in the example of the kind of We Are All Women campaign, like scenes of rape, or the images depicted in the street violence in Syria, right? Because we don't know which kind of people, there are going to be some people who are witnessing these images who may have undergone or suffered from some of these issues themselves. So we ultimately say, given it is not necessary for fundraising institutions to employ these tactics, the harm incurred to the consumer hugely outweighs the increased ability to raise funds. And I'm actually going to show you how actually it harms them to raise funds. So this should be a non-issue. Second of all, we ban something when an individual cannot act rationally and they cannot consent to the product being provided. Openly told you well that's true, and my extension is now going to impact that and tell you why this leads to less effective fundraising and worse discourse surrounding these issues. Because ultimately we think it's important that people engage with some of the most important things that are going on in our society. Okay, Basically, one of the biggest issues that charities currently face is the quality of the donor that they recruit is fairly poor, right? In the status quo, there are significant proportions of people who sign up under pressure, under tax of coercion, and subsequently cancel their subscription, leading to the charity making a loss on that matter. Why is this the case? Well, we say, look, when you're presented with overly sensitive, quite emotive advertising, you are more inclined to make impulsive decisions. So when you're committing to a direct debit, no thank you, like a long-term financial commitment on a fundamentally coercive level, we as an individual, at a time when we are not being coerced, are likely to cancel that process, and we're likely to cancel it earlier than we would have done had we have not been signed up in that way. And there are a number of harms to this, because there are two fundamental things, no thank you, two things that are currently debilitating fundraising efforts. First of all, extortionate administrative fees. Big charities like UNICEF, who 30% of the amount of funds they use goes back into fundraising, right? So we say we tackle this problem, at least on our side, no thanks, because we get individuals being less coerced and therefore signing up to charities that optimally suit them rather than the first one that comes along. Therefore, they give for longer and the cost of recruiting them is offset by the fact they're giving for longer. So all of the stuff, no thank you, the opening up tell you about we want to raise more money, is solved when, instead of coercing people into giving and ultimately them cancelling their subscription, we reduce the cost of recruiting them because we're getting people actually opting in to the charities that most suit them and ultimately living longer. So on that metric, we feel that we get better donors, and that solves quite a lot of the problems. But second of all, the perception of charities to some extent is going to be improved, because we say a lot of people in this room would acknowledge that a lot of these things, when the motion came up, those images, those adverts are coercive, and it's also a reason why some people do not give to the charities. That's another group of people that we're targeting with this. And finally, the fact that you've reduced the cost of recruitment, the fact that these institutions are now less wasteful, again, you improve the perception of these charities as not being wasting institutions that are buying all their money into these parts. Yes.
Charity giving is not a zero-sum game. People who donate to these charities will simply not donate at all if you don't have these sorts of images.
Okay, that's not true, right? We say the point at which, 100 people walk past someone in the street trying to sell them a charity. Of those 100 people, 3 people sign up, right? It's a 3% game. You can walk past that person 10, 11, 12 times. So the type of people that sign up on the spot are the type of people that, when presented with advertising at some point, would also sign up, because there's a fairly low number of people who sign up to charities. So say, look, the point at which you can capture someone on the street and get them to sign up to a charity under coercive imaging is the type of person that maybe in the future, maybe a year down the line or 18 months down the line, when presented with the same sorts of argument, will also sign up to charity. We don't see there's an absolutely necessary way. This is the only way that people sign up. And we say that even if those, the types of individuals that only would sign up in this way are much more likely to cancel, you're more likely to make a loss on that donor anyway, which is much worse for those charities involved. Right? And this fits into the next point. So tackling this idea of discourse, and we had this idea that people in the US referring to Africa as a state, and this is a massive problem. Look, we told you how these images lead to an individual making impulse decisions on one of the first choices that they're pitched by, leading them to cancel sooner. This is bad because, once you're signed up in a coercive manner to a charity, they don't consider other charities when presented by them because, look, I'm already giving to an international charity. Mr. Speaker, UNICEF, Red Cross and Help Syria are not homogenous. They're all very, very different charities. However, we'd like to argue that on a moral level, they're probably all equally as good, right? No one's going to distinguish between the value that they do. Therefore, we would like for an individual to choose the charity that they optimally care about, give money to that charity for longer, and ultimately improve our commitment to these issues, right? Because we ultimately say, look, there are a vast number of international aid charities out there, and if we can get people to firstly not disengage with these charities because they've been coerced by the first one they came across, firstly it addresses all their problems. Well, no, thank you. The problems of that discourse, because now they start at least when they start listening to the advertising of other campaigns, right? They don't just switch off when it comes on because they're already giving. But second of all, they end up giving to the charity that connects them the longest, which means overall on an aggregate sum, more people are giving for longer to more charities they care about. So because of that, because of all the problems that come on that side, individuals never engage with these other charities because the average voter feels like his moral obligation is lifted once he has contributed in some way. We'd rather have them engage in that process and give for longer. So what have we told you? We've told you that these images and this advertising is incredibly harmful to the individuals as they witness them. It can cause incredible, intense emotional distress. We've told you that it is fundamentally coercive, but we've also told you that by removing this, we can improve our commitment to international aid by getting better donors, donors that give for longer, and ultimately who engage more with the issues at hand, all of which we think are vastly more important than some half-hearted attempt to increase short-term aid. For all those reasons, we beg you to oppose.
Thank you, John. Now I'd like to invite opposition member to continue the case for the opposition side.
Madam Speaker, we think it's bizarre that the only attempt of opening government to justify why the level of donations will remain consistent under their policy was to assert that they would use critical long-term faculties. From closing opposition, we are first going to win the legitimacy case conclusively, then we're going to explain why their policy leads to huge losses of life in short-term and in long-term scenarios. First of all, miscellaneous points of rebuttal. First thing they say, one of the first things they say is that charities are political. First of all, we think they're political on either side of the house. We don't see why they're more or less political on either side. But second of all, we're not sure why the survivors of the Haitian earthquake would be fussed about the fact that there is some sort of political end to the fact that their lives are being saved. So no explanation as to why that was less important to them. Then they say they'll get ramshackled solutions as a result of short-termism, right? What he actually means is that you get more immediacy of donation, right? Because people desperately want to do something because they empathise with those individuals, right? That is just necessary sometimes in humanitarian disasters, where if you don't get that money immediately, you can't drag survivors out of the rubble because you don't have the money to get the cranes there. We just think that that is important. Then Fergus talks about for a long time taking away support for longer term projects. The first thing that we'd say is that most donors, when they donate to Oxfam or UNICEF, don't tie their donation to specific disasters, so that harm just doesn't exist, right? They may donate on the basis that bad things are happening in Sudan, but Oxfam and UNICEF can basically send that money where they want. Second thing we'd say is that lots of the short-term projects are preventing the similar disasters happening in the long term, right? And are hence long-term in and of themselves. The third thing that we'd say is that you can still get medium-term infrastructure projects from emotional appeals, right? For example, water aid, the fact that someone doesn't have any water to live leads to wells which will affect communities for years and years. But lastly, we just say that we don't understand why we should weigh the famine in Western Sahara as less important than necessarily the funding of a school in suburban Lagos. They gave us no reason why we should suppose that that was true. Then John says in closing government, I'm going to deal with the rest of his stuff interwoven, but he says that you just get better funding as a result of this, right? We say if that were true, we don't understand why charities wouldn't just be doing it anyway, right? We think that Oxfam and UNICEF tend to run continuing emotional appeals to make sure that these individuals' direct debits do continue into the future, and don't understand why that point works. On legitimacy, and what Matt says about the illegitimacy in prostituting images, dealing with the rationality of the donor later, what we would first of all say is that these individuals who Matt is claiming the rights are being broken of are tethered necessarily to the interests of others in their community, right? They're not the only person dying, and therefore they are automatically, their rights to a certain extent are influenced by the rights who are being conflicted of others. These are not individual problems, and therefore an individual liberty weighs less at the point at which you would assume that all of those other people who are not having their photo taken would probably want to live rather than their charity use that for political ends or whatever the hell he said. We also say that it's compounded by the fact that, as Matt says, informed consent or the lack of is very difficult to attain. Therefore, that decision necessarily has to be deferred to a third party. The next thing we just say is that what Matt misses all the way through his speech is that rights just regularly clash with each other, right? Especially in situations of life and death, we would regularly overrule an individual's right to choose over their right to live. We say that consent and individual liberty is therefore merely just a vehicle to facilitate good for individuals, and so given what I'm about to talk about, it's going to get outweighed by more lives saved. But even if this debate was about duty rather than utility, we say that states in general have a duty to the lives of individuals born outside their borders simply because that's an arbitrary thing which means that they shouldn't be punished for. So they lose on that. No thank you. Right, why are graphic images so important? Pointing out that when we win this point, the harm on their side is just a huge reduction in the amount of lives saved by charitable appeals. The first thing that we would say is it just closes the gap of feeling and of detachment, right? The fact that something is so emotive and shocking takes away and makes up for the fact that you're a self-interested individual living thousands and thousands of miles away from the fact that that is happening, right? You see an individual suffering just as you would if you would see them on the street, pointing out that that is how individuals would want their moral decisions to be made, a way in which they would make it if that person was just there, because it brings that closer to them and brings it into more of a moral perspective for that individual. That's why we say that that makes it a more rational action as opposed to an irrational action, because what we say is fundamentally, Madam Speaker, numbers just can't express things as well as much as photos do from the point of view of a moral actor. So when we say that 50,000 people have died in Syria like in the last 3 months, we don't imagine that is lining up all of your Facebook friends 10 or 100 times over and shooting them all in the head. That is not something that can be talked about unless you have a photo, unless you have an emotional appeal. And John even concedes that at the point at which he says these are impulse decisions, right? These are things which viscerally enter the minds of individuals and something which they don't constantly have to internalize in order to make sure they're giving to charity. We also say it removes tunnel vision, right? It shocks people out of the routine on their lives, right? John's point about chuggers on the street adequately shows this, right? Most people will walk past a chugger on the street simply because they're just an individual who isn't suffering, right? But they're more likely to act at the point at which they see someone on the TV because that takes them out of that routine. That is something which is fundamentally shocking. And it creates an ability to empathize with these individuals, right? That's why what Matt says about it being dehumanizing is wrong, right? It's the most humanizing thing you can do to put that individual on the screen so that you can have an emotional connection with that person. We'd further point out that in terms of efficiency, right, just in terms of TV time, these charities now have to spend a lot more advertising their campaigns, right? At the point at which you have a shocking image, you can get the most amount of donations for the least amount of seconds on a TV channel. That's really good for that. But also we would say that an individual is just better able to rationalise how they're solving that problem to themselves. It's a lot easier to think about saving a life now than it is to think about the benefits you can give to a person by building a road. Right, so last thing I'm going to talk about is the information to make choices and the right of states to allow organisations to do this. So we think that within any organisation within a free democracy, we think that they have the right to provide true information for individuals to make meaningful choices. So we think that what often happens, right, is the state systematically denies its citizens the ability to enact their moral interests and will upon the rest of the world. What do I mean by this, right? What I mean by this is that there is literally no incentive for the UK government to talk about the plight of Yazidis in Iraq, right, until their citizens are alerted to it by other means, because it would require them to do something about it in terms of money spent, and would also make them look bad because they're partially at fault for the fact that they caused those harms, right? That means it is the role of aid agencies, right, in society to provide that information and to hold governments to account, and to do so in a way which overcomes that gap of feeling and allows individuals to make meaningful choices which their governments may not necessarily otherwise provide. That may necessarily have to be a short emotional appeal on a TV channel. Madam Speaker, I'm so happy to oppose.
Madam Speaker, you're walking on the streets of London and you see a homeless person who is suffering on the street. And you decide, because you see that suffering and you are somehow shocked out of your routine, although I'm going to address how that doesn't really work that way, you are going to give that person money instead of giving a charity that would deal with homeless person and help them money. And we will explain why that isn't the idea of you need to find better charities who will actually help that person, rather than giving it because you are somehow shocked out of your routine, you are giving the first person you are seeing money, and how that actually helps people. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, I'm going to answer 3 main questions. So firstly, I'm going to talk about when does shocking people out of their routine work, and how does actually giving money to charities who show these images work, which will tackle directly what closing opposition has come to. I'm going to talk about saving money and saving lives, and how this actually doesn't work. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about what John said and how we create better charities and things like that. But firstly, on one attack, because we have closing opposition coming and saying, well, these are best practices, why don't these things happen already? Well, firstly, we also have financial regulations, because we don't think everybody just thinks this is the best practice, we're going to do it, right? The reason why not not everybody is doing it is firstly because we have a race to the bottom from a lot of charities who want to steal from other charities because they know they're going to be able to do that if they just have these, violent images. Secondly, we think it's still harmful because not everybody's doing this, right? We see Stonewall, they're not doing this. They are doing good campaigns and good policies, right? But they still have money, for example, and possible donors being stolen simply because they have graphic images. Again, donors will not be good donors as we're trying to push forward because they will eventually not want to subscribe to that cause when they realize that's not what they actually want. So we need to tackle that, right? Simply because or if it was the best thing, everybody would be doing it, is not a good enough response to it. So when does this work? No, thank you. Firstly, we don't think it works, for example, you're sitting on your couch and you see a commercial for one of these charities and you see it's really gruesome and you decide to go and donate money. The moment it works is when you are on the street and you are ambushed by these people who come and show you all sorts of graphic images, and that's the moment that you cave in, right? And cave in is the important word here, right? Because you are forced to actually donate to that cause because you feel bad, right? Now, they come and say, well, if we wouldn't make people feel bad, they would never actually donate. And I'm moving on to my second point right now, right? Like saving money and saving lives and all that thing. Firstly, we think that everybody wants to give to charity because people want to believe that they're good people, right? We don't think that the moment that you stop shocking them and making them and forcing them to like think that there's bad things happening in the world, they will not give money otherwise. We see that people still want to give money because that's how society is creating them, right? Like everybody wants to believe that they're good, and at one point in their lives, they donate to charity, money to charity. However, the moment you have donated to one charity, and this even studies show this, but I'm going to try to explain this, you are less likely to give more money to other charities because you feel as if your responsibility as being a nice person has been completed, right? No, thank you. And this is problematic, right? Because they come and say then that because there's more money, we save more lives. Again, I'm not really sure they've ever proven that there's more money, it always saves lives. We've seen the disasters that happen with international aid organizations when they have too much money funding all sorts of really bad charities for the Haiti earthquake, right? And this was already talked in first government. When we have so much money, it doesn't always mean it gets to those people, right? Because if you give money to bad charities, or to charities who are not connected, or to charities who simply do not have the infrastructure of taking that money forward, you're not actually saving lives. Sure.
Even under the status quo, the majority of donations don't go to bad charities and instead go to Oxfam or UNICEF. Why do you think that you get a dramatic increase in the amount of money going to good charities on your side of the house?
Okay, so firstly, we still believe that you still have people donating even without those images, right? Because for example, when you know that earthquake Haiti happened, you are giving money because you know people are suffering a lot, right? You don't necessarily give money you wouldn't give otherwise, simply because, for example, you have these images, right? But what we think is more important is that people are able to match themselves, and this is what John has been talking to an extension, like having charities have better strategies of finding people. We think it's really important that people are able to match themselves with a certain charity that they believe in. Now, why is this important? This is important for different reasons. Firstly, we believe that the moment that you are recruited to a certain cause that you believe in, you are more likely to A, be somebody who constantly donates to that cause, B, you're even more likely to have political capital towards that cause, which we believe the charities want, because sometimes these things of change happen like this. And so we think you become a better donor the moment that you are matched to a cause in which you believe. Now, what happens when we permit charities to have this kind of advertising is you're being snatched in a way from those charities that you will eventually be able to get to and to find charities that you would be able to, yes.
Example about the beggar proves that you will give money once you see that someone's suffering. If you don't see those pictures that are going to be sensational, who will those people give money to?
Thank you for reminding me. That's why so many people go buy beggars in London and nobody gives money, right? Because shocking doesn't always work. Secondly, we still do not believe it's better to give money to that beggar than it would be to give money to a homeless person, I need to be politically correct. Or to give money to a charity that would be able to use that money in the most optimal way, right? We believe that it's important that if you really do believe in that, you should be able to find that charity no matter what. Now again, we believe that it's important for these charities to be led this way because otherwise we have a race to the bottom, right? Because we believe you have charities who want to be able to snatch donations from other ones. Because again, once somebody has donated to a cause, he's much, much less likely to donate again because he believes that his duty has already been accomplished. So if we want to create better charities and we want to create better donors, we need to be able, A, to match them, and B, to make sure that these donors understand what they're opting into. That's why we believe in campaigns that appeal to, and as opening government has also said, to appease leads to rationale because we believe that it's much less longer than you feeling bad for a certain population in Africa, even though, you might give money now. We believe in creating better donors and a better structure in which funding would happen than before. So at the end of the day, we still have never been proven that somehow there's vastly much money or more money simply because you are shocking people into doing this, right? Because the only moment it would happen is when it happens on the street. So otherwise, you need to be able to appeal to people to make them give to your cause in other ways. And we believe that appealing to a rationale works in a much longer way and makes donors be better in that regard. And also because we believe that simply it's not true that you should disregard all the bad things that opening government has also been talking about and disregard consent and all those things. So at the end of the day, we need to think about what creates better charities. And we believe better charities are charities that are permitted to have rational, sensible advertising, like Stonewall, for example, instead of just letting them make, a fiasco of everything. So for those reasons, I beg to propose.
Now to conclude today's debate, I'd like to invite the opposition whip, Stephen.
I want to look at two things from Whip. The first thing I want to look at is the legitimacy of this action and why it's actually necessary on a moral level and a practical level. And the second thing I want to look at is why it necessarily increases on our side of the house how much aid is provided and actually increases the level of positive aid. Right? So what we hear from opening is this idea that it necessarily dehumanizes people when you use their image in a way that in a way to get money. Right? Two responses on actually how we don't even think we dehumanize them at all. The first thing is we say that often individuals feel dehumanized because they can see the other people dehumanizing them, right? Seeing them as lesser beings. We say that doesn't even exist in the scenario at the moment, even if you assume that people see them as lesser, because they're in completely different countries, right? Which means you can't get the kind of thing that Matt talks about, where you feel yourself lesser as the person with you, because they're not even with you. But secondly, what we say, what Richard very clearly points out to you, actually, you don't dehumanize them at all. You literally do the opposite, right? You say that their humanity is so valuable to me that it not only makes me cry and empathize, but I actually want to help you. I want to do as much as I can to value your life, to prevent you from suffering future harm, and preventing others from suffering harm, right? But we say that even if all of that wasn't true, and we were dehumanizing those individuals, right, it doesn't solve the debate for that, right? Because it raises the question, no thanks, mate, it raises the question of whether or not we need to prioritize the dehumanization of one individual or like a group of individuals on those photos over the lives of other individuals, right? Because what we say is they set up a false debate when they say this is like sex tapes, right? It's not at all, because the harm influence is not an individual harm, right? These are millions of people suffering from the exact same problem, right? Before I go on, I'll take Fergus.
Okay, the involvement of other people doesn't alter the illegitimacy. It's no more acceptable for you to assume that the community consents to dehumanizing images than that the individual does, especially when those images ultimately create short-term solutions and neo-colonial.
Okay, we're going to show why it doesn't lead to short-term solutions, but the reason it is so significant is, for example, if you ask like the rest of the community that assuming this is dehumanizing for this one person, would you be okay for that because it provides you with benefits, right? Provides you with, I don't know, like water, the ability not to suffer from those things in the future, they would consent. In fact, we would say, actually, and you give us no reason to say why the individual themselves wouldn't consent to that, right? And as we POI do at the start of the debate, we say, would you get consent? And the response you give is, oh, it's impossible to get consent. No, it's not. We get consent all the time for photos, right? You actually then concede the case when you say, fine, we assume you can't get consent, but if we did, then it wouldn't be so problematic. But going back to this, right, we say that the actual harm suffered to individuals are more important. Why is that, right? Because opening government and then closing government hinge their case on this idea that rights trump all, right? I have a right not to be dehumanized. I have a right to privacy. But what Richard tells you is, unfortunately, there are always going to be right clashes, right? There are going to be clashes of right. In this scenario, your ability, your right not to be dehumanized, your right to have privacy, clashes with the rights of other people, including yourself, actually, but definitely other people, to have food, to have water, to not die of drought. They never give you any reasons why we can't why we have have to prioritise the individual over the other. But what do we tell you from closing as to why you should do the opposite, right? Firstly, we say necessarily the right to life, and that's increasing aid in order to provide these people with that life and a better life, necessarily trumps privacy and the right to be dehumanised. But you can't have privacy without a life, right? So in and of it, to the extent you respect privacy, you have to acknowledge that that comes from the ability to live and to live a life which you have something to be private from, right? So if you're not alive or you don't have a house, you have nothing to keep private, right? But secondly, what we say is like, why actually do we care about dehumanising in this instance? We say the reason their lives have been dehumanised is because their lives have been dramatically worsened, and that's why they're vulnerable. That's exactly why we need to ensure that other people don't suffer that harm, right? And we say that actually the actor in this round, obviously, is like the state, all these organisations. We say, again, even if the stuff I told you wasn't true, it seems to be unclear why the state doesn't owe an obligation to humankind and people in general, rather than a single individual, right? Moreover, we hear from closing, right, this idea that it's illegitimate because I'm going to be coerced to sign up. Well, Richard tells you actually it's illegitimate not to give me the full information to make that decision, right? Like in the whip speech, we hear this idea that I'm going to get bullied into signing up. What Richard says is, in this policy on our side of the house, you give everyone exact the amount of information you can provide, right? The graphic images are true images, right? You say, look, this is the truth. You decide for yourself. The only response we get on this is, no, you're ambushed in the street with television images. Well, no, because you're at home watching television images, and you can then decide for yourself best where you want to contribute that money, right? So second point of clash, right? Now we've shown you that this is legitimate and actually morally necessary. No thanks, mate, I've taken you guys already. Second point, right? Why in particular is this actually the most effective way, right? Opening opposition point out automatically at the start of the debate this idea that images are more powerful, right? But Richard gives you 4 reasons as to why that's true. The first thing he tells you is it closes the gap of detachment, right? The reason I care more about people on the street in my country is I can see them, right? I can see them right there. They're necessarily influencing my life, which is why we all generally feel uncomfortable when we walk past someone who's homeless and we don't give them money, right? Because they're in our sphere of influence, right? Graphic images close that attachment. You show very clearly the harm that has been suffered by these individuals, right? Secondly, what we say is visceral images in particular, so really graphic ones, the sensationalist ones in particular, are necessary to shock people, right? Because the problem is we hear numbers all the time, right? Unfortunately, thousands and thousands of people die every day. Those are just words on a page, right? Comparatively, when you see someone crying, that attack, or someone like in a huge amount of pain, that like touches you on a human level, right? You sympathise with them. Even if you're not the same colour as them, you see them as a human. You see them as someone who suffers. You, as Richard tells you, you relate to them in a way that, for example, that could be my child, that could be someone I care about, or they're just a human who I care about. That means you're far more likely to donate than if it had just been like this idea of you're magically going to use your critical facilities, right? Because that's what we hear from these guys. But to the extent that's true, why do we still get, for example, on our side of the house, better long-term aid anyway? Firstly, Richard tells you how money isn't just used for reconstruction, but for prevention, right? So when we show images of people suffering from drought, we don't just go in and give them temporary food. We prevent them from suffering droughts in the future. Secondly, as Richard tells you, what happens is, like, for example, governments in the status quo have incentives not to show you the full truth, right, for geopolitical reasons, right? If they show you, for example, in America, disabled kids in Vietnam, that raises questions about shouldn't we pay reparations for the damages we did to them in bombing them, right? However, we need then the NGOs to give us that full information in order to get us to short-term and long-term goals. We tell you that this is not just morally legitimate, it's morally necessary for those millions of people who are suffering, but secondly, we tell you it increases the pool of money given in aid, and it increases the quality of the aid as well, so we couldn't be prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Watching it.